Welcome to part 5 of the Bouquet Toolkit. This video is all about binding, and I will show you how to use the florist tape to part bind and fully bind the stems of the roses for wedding bouquets and posies. And then I'll also show you how to use the twine to do a twine binding. And then I'll also show you how to do the underbinding if you're going to have full binding and then the full binding. Do use the timestamps in the video description to jump around to the part of the video that you need to watch for the arrangement that you are making. So depending on which arrangement you're making, you'll either need to part bind or fully bind the stems once you've made your roses. I would only generally part bind the roses if I'm doing a fully bound ribbon handpiece, because the stems don't need to be fully bound and it's just a waste of resources. I'll fully bind them if I'm using a twine binding, and several of my arrangements do use twine binding. So part binding a single stem rose is very simple. You simply need to wind the florist tape around the bunchy bit of the underside of the rose. If you have some difficulty doing this, you can use a little bit of high tack glue just around that bunchy bit, and then bring the florist tape down about halfway down the foil stem, about 14 to 16 centimetres. I will normally seal off the end of the florist tape with a little bit of PVA glue, because when we go on to the next stage of making these bouquets, sometimes they can unravel if they're not secured in place. So just seal off the end of the florist tape with a little bit of PVA glue, and then you have your part bound stem. So for the full binding with the florist tape, it's the same process as the part binding, except instead of stopping at 16 centimetres, we'll carry on to the very bottom. Once you reach the bottom of the stem, you want to bring the florist tape around so that you can fold it down over itself. This might take a little bit of practice. If you fold it over too far, the florist tape might slip off. But you carry on winding, just press it down with your fingertip and then continue winding around, but bring the florist tape back up the stem. Bring it back up the stem at least 4 centimetres. Trim off the florist tape and secure it in place with a little bit of PVA glue. On some of my arrangements, you might need to bring the florist tape up a little bit higher than 4 centimetres. I will specify this in the individual tutorials. It's all very dependent on how far the twine is going to be bound along the handpiece. For twine binding, I'll normally start at the bottom of the arrangement. Hold the twine, the end of the twine, so that it's pointing slightly up towards the top of the bouquet, and then bring the twine around the stems so that it catches the loose part of the twine. Bring the twine round about 2 or 3 times, and then pop a little bit of PVA glue just along the stems and the loose bit of twine. And then what we want to do is continue winding the twine all the way up the stems. Try to make sure that your twine is close together. If you find you've got little gaps, you can push them together with your fingertips. And if you're using natural twine, you will find that some bits of the twine are thicker than others. But you can work with that, and we just carry on winding until you reach the top of the bouquet where the flowers start spreading out. At this point, I will trim off the twine, bring around a large loose loop, and with the loose end of the twine I will just poke it through the loop and pull tight. That will secure the end of your twine, and you can add a bit of PVA glue or high-tack glue and let that dry before you add any of the ribbons. So to make the ribbon loops that edge the bouquet, I like to use this Oasis waterproof ribbon. It's a poly satin ribbon and you can get it in a variety of colours. I would usually use ivory or white, and that would depend on what colour I was going to bind the handpiece in. So the rolls are 91 metres long and the ribbon is 5 centimetres wide. And to make one pair of ribbon loops, I would cut the Oasis ribbon at about 26 centimetres. Occasionally, I will make these bigger or smaller, and I will specify in each of the individual tutorials if that is the case. But for most arrangements, I would cut the Oasis ribbon at about 26 centimetres, and then simply split it down the middle. If you haven't quite got them equal, you can just tear a few millimetres off to make them equal. So the reason I use this waterproof ribbon around the edge of the bouquet is because it holds its shape much better than a regular satin ribbon. A satin ribbon can tend to flop down. So I do occasionally use coloured satin ribbon around the edge of some of my arrangements, but I will still use this poly ribbon, as the poly ribbon does tend to hold the satin ribbon loops in place. So take one of your strips of ribbon and just staple it together at one end. Using a stapler is optional, but I really just find that it's a lot easier to use a stapler. It just holds it in place. So to attach these ribbon loops to the edge of the bouquet, we're just going to bind them in place with the sewing thread. And what I'll usually do is put some glue around the underside of the stems. And then I'll take my thread and wind it around on itself so that it won't unravel. And I'll take the first ribbon loop and nestle it between two of the book page roses. And then I'll wind the thread around 2 or 3 times to hold it in place. So long as you keep the tension on the thread, you can then add the second ribbon loop in the same way. Just nestle it in between 2 of the book page roses. Now some of the arrangements we will add the ribbon loops in different ways, but I will specify that on the individual tutorials as well. So continue adding the loops around the arrangement. If they flop down a little bit whilst you're winding the thread around, you can just flick them back up. It's just that the thread causes a little bit of tension. Once all the loops are in place, wind the thread around a few more times and bring it down to just below the ribbon. And then using a little bit of glue, just run a small drizzle around the thread in the direction that the thread is being wound. And that will just hold it in place. You don't need to wait for it to dry. I will always use an underbinding if it's for a wedding bouquet. any bouquet that you're going to be wanting to hold for a long period of time. This is because it just gives a much smoother finish to the handpiece, and it adds a little bit of extra comfort when you're going to be holding the arrangement for long periods of time throughout the day. So for the underbinding, I use the Oasis poly ribbon again. I'll tear off a strip that's about 60 to 80 centimetres and I'll split it in half. So I'll usually add a little bit of glue in between the stems just to ensure that when that glue has dried, the stems are all held firmly together. This part can get a little bit messy, but it really is worthwhile just to give the flowers a little bit more durability throughout the day. So take a strip of the poly ribbon and wind it around itself underneath the roses. Pull it nice and tight and wind it down. The stems might start to spread out a little bit at the bottom, but keep the tension on the ribbon. When you get down to the bottom of the stems, using a little bit of sellotape, just hold that poly ribbon in place. Then cut off about 10 centimetres of the poly ribbon. Add some glue to the bottom of the stems. Place the small strip of poly ribbon over the end of the stems, and then using a small piece of sellotape, secure it in place. This part isn't particularly glamorous, but it works, so just bear with me. If you find you still have any gaps where you can see the stems through the poly ribbon, use just a little bit more of the ribbon just to cover them up. Use the sellotape to fold down the flaps on the end, and be as liberal as you need to be with the sellotape, as what you want to do is you want to make sure that there's no lumps or bumps on the underbinding at all. You'll really feel the difference in the sturdiness of the handpiece at this stage. The stems will be less likely to bend and it will just give a firmer hold. So once the underbinding is all in place, we can add the ribbon binding. Now I really like to use a single-sided knitted ribbon. The reason they're easy to bind with is because they're single-sided and they're knitted. You've got a little bit of stretch in them, which means you can get a really good finish on the handpiece. If you use a double-sided satin, it won't be quite as forgiving and it can be a little harder to achieve a really smooth finish. So cut 2 lengths of the ribbon at 9 centimetres each. You may only need 1 strip of ribbon for a small posy, but I'll show you how to bind with 2, and again I'll let you know on each of the individual tutorials whether you need 1 strip or 2 strips. So add a little bit of glue on the very end of the handpiece. And then take 1 piece of your ribbon and place it so that it's just covering over half of the base of the handpiece. You want to have about 4 to 6 millimeters hanging over the edge of the handpiece. Hold it in place with your finger and your thumb, and then take your thread and wind it around about 2 to 3 centimeters from the end of the handpiece. Then take your second cut piece of ribbon, hold the thread in place with your thumb, and then take hold of the thread with your other hand so you can lift your thumb just to place the strip of ribbon underneath. Align it so that it's covering the first strip, but also that it's hanging over the other edge about 4 to 6 millimeters. And then wind your thread around a few times. Once you're happy with the position, what we want to do is fold down one of the loose ends, bring the thread up slightly and hold it down, and you should be about 2 to 3 millimeters from the very end of the handpiece, and then wind the thread around a few times. And do the same with the other side, and you should have a nice squared finish on the bottom of the handpiece. Wind the thread back down to the very ends of the ribbon and then snip off the thread, and then to stop it unravelling just add a little bit of glue. Spread it around the thread, it will hold it in place. Then what we need to do is take your ribbon on the reel and place it at an angle and then wind it around on itself and bring it very slightly upwards towards the end of the handpiece. And then you can start to wind the ribbon back up the handpiece to the top of the flowers. If you find that the ribbon starts to fold a little bit, try to keep the tension on, and if that doesn't help, you can just tuck the folded bit underneath the new part that you're winding around. These folds occur a lot less using the single-sided ribbon, and they'll happen quite frequently if you're using a double-sided satin ribbon. Once you get to the top of the arrangement, wind the ribbon around a couple more times, snip off the ribbon from the reel, add a little bit of glue just to the underside of the ribbon, and then secure it temporarily with a dressmaker's pin. Adding the trailing ribbons is very simple. You can add as many ribbons as you like, and if you want to make them exactly the same as my arrangements, then I will detail the lengths that I'm using in each of the individual tutorials. All you need to do is cut your length of ribbon, tie it in a loose knot around the handpiece, bring that loose knot up to where your dressmaker's pin is and tighten. Once you've tightened it, that should hold the handpiece binding in place, and you can pull out your dressmaker's pin and tie the ribbon in a second knot. If I'm adding 2 ribbons, I will just repeat that process and make sure that it's tied around the first ribbon. You can choose to tie this ribbon in a bow, or you can cover it with a little embellishment simply by gluing it on, just to make the arrangement your own. If you have any questions about the binding at all, then do leave them in the comments below and I will get back to you as soon as I see them.